but we talk boxing now, and a new biography of one of the greats, marvellous Marvin Hagler. The book is called Marvellous, the Marvin Hagler story, and the co-author is Damian Hughes. Damian, good to see you.
Professor Damian Hughes to you.
Okay, all right.
It's great to see you guys.
Professor Hughes, good afternoon. He's not
the title yet.
You've been in before to talk boxing with us. You wrote a fine biography of Tommy Hearns, and this is one of his worthy adversaries as well. And say so many great fights. I mean, some of the greatest fights of all time, if not the greatest. Some people still argue the Hearns fight, don't they?
Well, it's been voted certainly the greatest round ever. That first round when they went at each other like alley cats. He's still voted now just for the intensity of what both men put into it, and for the 8 minutes of mayhem is what it's often referred to. It's an incredible fight. And this was part of it, that when we looked at, when I was writing the Tommy Hearns book, we were looking back at the last great golden age of boxing, and we couldn't believe that there was no book that had been written that captured Marvin Hagler's story. And to me, when I read it, or when I started the research, he's the boxer that we all wish we could have been. I mean, when you think about the likes of Muhammad Ali or Sugar Ray Leonard or Sugar Ray Robinson, they were blessed with almost supernatural gifts, whereas Hagler was almost an everyman. You know, he had a certain level of skill, but it was his intensity and his whole attitude to the game that meant, we could all identify with him.
What's great about him, sorry, boy, and we were talking about this in the break, what's great about him is he's got his money, he's kept his money, and he's kept his health. And you can't say that about all great champion boxers.
Well, that's part of the reason that I really love him and really and love this 3 years in terms of researching and writing about the book, because he's the only fighter that never did make a comeback. That he went out in an ignominious defeat to Leonard, but the fact is that he never attempted to come back, and exactly like you say, Andy, he's kept his money, he's kept his health, and he's on the overall scheme of it, he's come out a winner.
He lives a fairly frugal lifestyle. He lives in Milan, doesn't he? Lives over in Italy and lives a simple life. He says he's won, $40 million in purses over the years. He said, I live in a 2-bedroom apartment and I get by on $10,000 a month for everything. So he's looked after his money, isn't he?
Yeah, but I mean, the way that he ended his career is probably a really great example of how he lived his whole life. I mean, there's two characters when you talk about Marvin Hagler. There's Marvin Hagler, the man who, retained his integrity. So he grew up with two coaches, the Petronelli brothers in Brockton, who had no real pedigree in the fight game. And they invested in Hagler when he was a young man, so they never took money off him and they supported him. And he never forgot that. So even when he was in the super fights with Duran and Leonard and Tommy Hearns, so they were always in his corner. So as a man, he was a decent man. But as a fighter, what he said was he used to wrestle with what he described as his monster. And he said, and that was the character that used to come out when he was fighting. And what he'd do is, I mean, the whole preparation that he would do, he'd lock himself away in a self-imposed prison in Cape Cod for 8 weeks before a fight, where he'd strip any luxury out, so any TVs, the bed, any telephones, and he'd put himself into this monastic existence merely so he could blame his opponent for it.
So he could become this other. He had to become another character because fundamentally he's a decent bloke.
Yeah, well, Goody Petronelli, I mean, unfortunately he passed away last year, but when we interviewed him, he gave us a great quote where he said Hagler used to go to bed at 7 o'clock at night during these 8-week camps because he said he became that unpleasant. He used to upset himself as well.
Wow, yeah, that's incredible. But again, I'd forgotten this, but it's true, isn't it? And it says here in the blurb, it took him 7 years to get a shot at the title, didn't it? Or 8 years, was it? Something like that. He continually awarded 50 fights before he got a chance.
Joe Frazier warned him, didn't he, very early on?
Smoking Joe said that. Yeah, Smoking Joe gave him a warning after he saw him quite early on fighting in Philadelphia. He said, you've got 3 strikes against you. You're black, you're a southpaw, and you're actually very good. And I mean, it's unprecedented. You wouldn't get that in sport, especially in boxing today. But he fought 50 fights before he finally got a shot. I mean, the Petronelli brothers, his coaches I just mentioned, had to actually take his case to the US Senate. And they had a couple of senators actually start making inquiries before Bob Arum then granted him his first shot against Vito Antuofermo.
Wow, that's a shade to Jack Johnson about sort of 60 years before that kind of thing was going on.
Everybody remembers the Minter fight, and not just for the fight, but what happened afterwards. It was quite an unpleasant night, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you put it in the sort of social context, it was 1980. It was just before the Broadwater riots and the Brixton riots and things like that. The National Front was starting to become quite prominent, and Alan Minter didn't particularly help the case. He gave an interview to Des Lynam for Sports Night where he said, "I'll never lose my title to a black man." Now, Minter claims he's been misrepresented. He said it was, "I wouldn't lose it to that black man." But the point is, it stoked up a lot of racial tension. So when the fight actually happened, it was a real powder keg. And when Hagler, I mean, there's a famous quote that, again, Goody Petronelli told us. He said that when he was in the corner, Hagler said to him, "Whatever happens tonight, don't stop this fight. I'm prepared to die in the ring." Such was his intensity, and he butchered Minter in 5 rounds. He's the only world title holder that, when he won the world title, he never received his belt in the ring because the riot happened afterwards. And again, Hagler used that to feed his monster, that sense of injustice, that even though he'd won the title, he was still never heralded as a champion in the ring, was what he used to fuel him through the next 12 defences that he had.
Many of his fights were brutal. We'll come on to the sort of more celebrated ones, but there was one fight I remember fighting fighting Alan Minter at Mustafa Hamsho, and it was a dirty fight. He was a very dirty fighter. He was putting his head in a lot. And I remember at the time thinking, it was a really, really dirty fight. But then we saw the fight with Hagler and Hamsho, and that kind of was even worse. But he was on the receiving end, Hamsho, that time, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, Hamsho's name, I mean, and this is part of the beauty of the research that we've done, that there's just such a rich list of characters that he faced. And so Mustafa Hamsho, his nickname was the Syrian Buzzsaw, because he was crude, and he was just a sort of fighter that would, like, nobody wanted to face him. There was no glory to be gained in it. And Hagler eventually had to face him, and what he made a commitment to do was, he said, "If you want to fight dirty, I'm going to take you in the trenches and fight dirtier than what you've ever seen before." And Hagler, on the back of it, ended up giving Hamsho 55 stitches on the back of the fight, just because he promised him. He said, "If you want to go there, I'll take you to I'll take you down dark alleys you've never been before."
Well, there was that great quote from Simpson, wasn't there, about him? It's quite an incredible comment that he made about fighting. You may remind us of that, but fighting Hagler, what it felt like.
Yeah, I mean, the Tony Simpson fight was brilliant, because there's a brilliant clip that we discovered where, even if you knew nothing about boxing and you watch this clip, Hagler's just beaten a guy called Obel Maes out in San Remo in Italy. And he's doing an interview the next day with Harry Carpenter, and he's nice and he's affable. And then Harry Carpenter makes the fatal error saying, "We've got your next opponent here in the studio with us, Marvin." And he switches, in an instant, he switches from being polite and affable to being just the killer that he was in the ring. And when Simpson turns up to shake hands with him, Hagler waves his hand away and he says to him, "I'll shake your hand when I've beaten you." Right. Now, I'm a sports psychologist, and it's one of them where I love the whole idea of the mind, the mind games that he played. But from that minute on, Simpson was just in thrall to Hagler, where he ended up apologising to him, and he sat in the studio talking about how great Hagler was. When it came to the night of the fight, he was just completely outclassed. I mean, he froze to such an extent that he decided not to do any sparring in the 2 weeks before the actual fight itself. So Hagler just destroyed him on the night. And when he was interviewed afterwards, Tony Simpson described the experience of being locked up in a cage of pain and watching Marvin Hagler throw away the key.
Wow.
Do you know, we've run out of time. I'll tell you what, we're going to try and get you back just for a minute in a few moments. We want to talk about the Duran fight very quickly, and the Leonard fight, and of course Hearns as well. We'll do more so in a minute. We're chatting Marvin Hagler here in the studio. We must end our chat with Damian Hughes and his book Marvellous, the Marvin Hagler story, with the controversial Sugar Ray Leonard fight. We were honoured to meet Sugar Ray. He came in, didn't he, a couple of years ago. The top man, we spoke about this fight. He may have had a slightly different view on it than Marvin Hagler, but the scoring of it, people still argue about it to this day, don't they?
Still controversial. You can go into some bars in Boston and still get a smack in the mouth for arguing that Leonard won. But it was a lot of what happened up front that almost culminated in Hagler's own demise for this. So what Leonard and his camp, his lawyer was a guy called Mike Traynor, did was they conceded on the money and gave Hagler virtually the lion's share of the money, but what they insisted on was that they could decide the size of the round, or the size of the ring. So they chose the biggest ring possible because they knew that Leonard was going to spend his time running. They also insisted that it was a 12-round fight, not 15, because he knew that there was questions about Leonard's stamina. So they negotiated a lot of that. But there's a final twist in it that because Hagler was so bitter about the Minter loss that I spoke about earlier in the Brits, he refused to have a British judge sat at ringside.
It's Harry Gibbs, wasn't it?
Harry Gibbs, yeah. And now the irony was that afterwards, Harry Gibbs, that had been bumped off the judging panel, when he was asked for his scoring, he gave it to Hagler, which would have meant that Hagler would have actually won the fight.
Because it was a split decision, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, phenomenal fight.
Well, it's a fascinating story about a great fighter, and we wish you well with it, Damian. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in. So the Marvin Hagler story, Marvellous, by Damian and Brian Hughes, is available in hardback now.